an enemy shouldn't be protected by his morally bad character. So the more wrongfully he acts, the less we can do against him. I find these arguments hard to weigh against each other. In particular, since intuitive responses to different cases are different. And we could actually have lots of different cases, which I won't trouble you with. But it's an extremely important issue in the current context, as others have mentioned, because of the military actions against insurgent groups who regularly place military facilities amongst civilians. So Hamas and Hezbollah, the targets of Israeli actions, have placed military facilities, rocket launchers, and so on in civilian locations. And I think, in the public debates about those actions, the people who roundly condemn Israel, I think, are assuming that how the civilians got there doesn't matter. I mean, they were there, and whose responsibility is that they were there doesn't matter, and therefore they make a negative assessment of proportionality. I think the Israeli military takes the view that it does matter how the civilians got there. The deaths are discounted, and if different verdicts are reached, it's because the competing sides are making different judgments. As I say, I found this a difficult issue. I'd be interested to hear the views of others, particularly those in the military who have to make decisions about this sort of thing. I've read some newspaper reports from US military commanders, for example, in the Iraq War, which suggested that they thought responsibility, that there was discounting of civilian deaths when civilians were put in harm's way by the enemy. As I say, I think that's the view of the Israeli military. I should say, when I first wrote about this topic, I thought that morality aside, the law was quite clear, because Additional Protocol 1, while condemning the use of civilians as shields, also has a clause that says the violation by one party of its obligations under this protocol does not release the other side from its obligations under this protocol. And I took that to imply that if the enemy has wrongfully placed shields, places military facilities near civilians, that doesn't change our obligation not to cause disproportionate harm to those civilians. But that's me reading it as a philosopher and not a lawyer. And thanks to The Economist and David Roden, I was alerted to an analysis of the laws of armed conflict produced by the UK military based on the assessments of their military lawyers. And they take the view that if civilians have been placed near a military target by the enemy, that, I'm quoting it roughly, that counts in favor of the attackers in determining proportionality. They don't say how much it counts in favor, but their interpretation, I'm sure controversial, of international law is that the placement of civilians by the enemy near a military facility reduces the weight those civilians' deaths have. They don't say by how much in the assessment of proportionality that we make if we're contemplating attacking that facility. I find this a very difficult question. I think there are credible arguments on both sides. It's about whether evils count towards the proportionality, how much an evil effect of our action counts towards the proportionality of the action depends on whether the fact that that evil will result is partly the responsibility of a wrongful choice by somebody else, in particular our enemy. I don't have much time left, but that leads me to question 3 about weighing goods versus evils. And this is obviously immensely difficult topic. And here in particular, we're not going to be saying this has 7, this counts 7, and this counts 9, and this counts 23. You have to weigh preservation of national sovereignty against the killing of soldiers, the collateral killing of civilians. Those are very difficult things to do. But I will address in 2.5 minutes one key issue. And that's actually the question that Michael Walzer mentioned. Namely, how do we make decisions when we're choosing between the lives of, or risk to the lives of, our soldiers versus the lives of, or risks to the lives of civilians on the other side? Now, I should have said, actually, when I was discussing in bello proportionality, that the relevant goods include not just the war's just causes or contributions to those, but also reducing the harm the war will cause, for example, to our soldiers. And so there's a familiar choice between tactics that lower the risk to our soldiers at the cost of raising the risk to enemy civilians. You can think of the large-scale bombing of Iraq's infrastructure, which happened well behind the lines, the front lines in Kuwait in the 1991 war, or the decision in the Kosovo war that NATO made to fly its planes only above 15,000 feet, where they were out of the range of anti-aircraft fire, but where the risk of inaccurate bombing with civilian casualties was greater. So we have to make some sort of rough weighing between the lives of soldiers on our side and civilians on the other. It seems to me that there are arguments favoring both sides. Concerning our soldiers, well, first there are our compatriots. And I think governments and its officials have not only the permission, but in general a duty to prefer their compatriots' interests to those of foreigners. In addition, I think military commanders have a special responsibility to the soldiers under their command to protect them from harm, including by not exposing them to the risk of harm. On the other hand, the civilians on the other side are civilians. They haven't taken on the status of soldiers, and they therefore don't have a status that involves the permissibility of their being killed in wartime. I actually disagree with Jeff and David about what makes soldiers liable to be killed. I assume that if you have the status of soldier, you're someone whose death in war is not an injustice. Now, our soldiers do have that status. The civilians on the other side do not. So favoring our soldiers is the fact that they're our compatriots, that as military commanders we have additional special duties towards them. On the other hand, favoring the civilians on the other side is the fact that they are not soldiers, they are civilians. I find those competing considerations very hard to weigh against each other, but there is one further consideration, and that is that if we choose the tactic that is more protective of our soldiers, we will actively kill the civilians. We will have directly caused their deaths. We won't have intended their deaths in the double effect sense, but we will have actively caused their deaths. Whereas if we choose the tactic that has more risk for our soldiers, we won't have actively caused their death. Somebody else will have actively caused their death. Many people think that's a morally relevant consideration, and to me that tips the scale in favor of the enemy civilians, so that the right choice to make in that situation is to accept greater risks, somewhat greater risks for our soldiers in order to avoid somewhat lesser risks to civilians on the other side. But I'm not terribly, I'm not totally convinced by that. I mean, the issues are very difficult to weigh, and you certainly can't say anything very precise about it. So that was an attempt at a quick survey of issues about proportionality.
Thank you, Dr. Herka. And thanks for so carefully abiding by our stringent time limits. Next, we will hear from George Lucas. George Lucas is class of 1984, Distinguished Chair in Ethics in the Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the U.S. Naval Academy, and Professor of Ethics and Public Policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. He has taught at several universities, including Georgetown University, Emory University, the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, and served as Philosophy Department Chairman at the University of Santa Clara in California. He has received research fellowships from the Fulbright Commission and the American Council of Learned Societies, and has served 3 times as Director of National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institutes for college and university faculty. He's a summa cum laude graduate in physics from the College of William and Mary, received his PhD in philosophy from Northwestern University. He's also the author of 5 books, more than 40 journal articles, translations, and book reviews, and has also edited 8 book-length collections of articles in philosophy and ethics. His most recent book is Anthropologists in Arms, The Ethics of Military Anthropology. Turn it over to Dr. Lucas.
Thank you. The task we had this afternoon was to, after the discussion of the panel on just causes, was to think somewhat about some of the other categories of just war theory. Proportionality is indeed an elastic and elusive concept, and Professor Herka's work, which we've studied in our fellow seminar, along with Professor McMahon's, Jeff McMahon's, has done a lot, I think, to elucidate how we are to understand that concept of proportionality and how to carry out those calculations. And indeed, a lot of Professor Herka's work shows that some of the other categories, or indeed many of the other categories of the traditional classical just war tradition, can be, in a sense, shown to be covered or to have the work, proportionality will do the work that they're designed to do in some sense. They have a proportionality dimension. Things like probability of success, obviously, but even as this conversation suggests, just causes, and certainly necessity in the sense of last resort. So what I'd like to do in contrast, and this is driven in part by some of those military technologies in particular that were mentioned just as a category in passing in the last presentation, is to suggest that last resort turns out to be a very important category in the tradition, independent of proportionality calculations, in fact. And it's so foundational that I'm going to argue in a kind of perverse way late in the afternoon that most of the work of the tradition can be done by this concept properly understood. And that's because I'm going to argue that the principle in no way entails the comparative utilitarian calculations most frequently associated with it. Instead, it's entirely a matter of principle. Read between the lines, you've got a recalcitrant old-style Kantian caught between two utilitarians late in the afternoon, so I'm trying to be a little perverse. I realize this is a strange proposal to entertain. Michael Walzer is famously skeptical of the genuine value of the guidance purportedly offered by this criterion, since, as he remarks, there is, quote, always something more to do, another diplomatic note, another UN resolution, another meeting. And from an historical perspective, the criterion of last resort appears only sporadically and intermittently in the classical canonical lists of just war criteria, at least in the Western tradition. It does not appear at all in the list of justifiability criteria offered by Thomas, Vittoria, or Suarez, for example, though Suarez does comment elsewhere on the constraint. Last resort is invoked explicitly by Erasmus and importantly by Hugo Grotius, from whence, as James Turner Johnson complains, it makes its way gradually and covertly into international law and into contemporary reformulations of the classical tradition. There, the criterion that war always be pursued as the option of last resort helps supplant a once overriding concern for the restoration of justice and responsible exercise of sovereignty to protect the innocent that, Johnson argues, and you heard some of this argument this afternoon, once constituted the core of the classical tradition. The principle of last resort literally elbows aside this concern for justice in favor of a presumption against war and against the use of force generally, advocated illicitly by, among others, people that Jim calls crypto-pacifists within the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, precisely to make the resort to war in pursuit of an otherwise justifiable cause well nigh impossible to sustain. As historical scholars know full well, like Jim, the principle of last resort is much older than this account would suggest. It originates in the secular pre-Christian accounts of justifications for going to war, where it enjoys pride of place, to which I'd like to restore it now, as the principal consideration to be satisfied before resorting to war. It is not, explicitly at least, either the reasons for or the intentions behind a nation's appeal to war that finally matter. Those are assumed to be otherwise legitimate affairs of state. Rather, what matters is, whatever the nature of the dispute, that the adversaries make every conceivable good faith effort to avoid resorting to war to resolve it. This is evident in Cicero's account of last resort in De Officiis, grounded in the ancient Roman Republican custom of the fetiali, or priestly ambassadors of the Senate, whose role in warning potential adversaries of an imminent war was part of a required religious ritual that we now know as public declaration. We owe it, I believe, to Greg Reichberg and Henrik Suess and their young colleague Endred Begbie for pointing out that this is functionally a requirement that war always constitute a last resort, with public declaration merely denoting the elaborate procedure by which that constraint was once guaranteed in the ancient world. In a sense, this public declaration thing, if I may for a moment dwell on it, is badly misunderstood. When you see it cited now in some of the lists of just war criteria, it tends to get interpreted in a very culturally specific way. Say, in the U.S., we have the Congress's prerogative to declare war, and then the President, Commander-in-Chief, carries it out. Obviously, that doesn't itself carry over into other legitimate forms of sovereignty, but that's what that discussion looks like it's referencing, is legitimate authority. Whereas on the account that, not just that I'm giving it, but that we discover is the historically accurate account on Henrik and Greg's and Endra's work, it is not public declaration is not a discussion of legitimate authority. It is a guarantee, a procedure to guarantee that war is always illegal.